two of the largest passenger aircraft ever built are sitting on the same runway in thick fog, and neither crew can see the other. One of them believes it has permission to take off. It does not. The other is still taxiing down that same runway, looking for an exit it cannot find in the fog. A radio transmission meant to prevent exactly this situation is about to be misheard by the pilot already accelerating down the tarmac, garbled by another voice cutting across the same frequency at the same moment. 9 seconds before impact, the taxiing crew sees a pair of landing lights emerging from the fog, bearing down on them at flying speed. There is nowhere to go. On March 27, 1977, a KLM Boeing 747 and a Pan American Boeing 747 collided on a runway at Los Rodeos Airport on the island of Tenerife. 583 people died. It remains, to this day, the deadliest accident in the history of aviation. Neither aircraft was even supposed to be there that day. Neither pilot wanted to be on that runway in fog, and the collision itself lasted only seconds. But behind those seconds sat a chain of small, human decisions. A bomb threat at another airport, a tight schedule, an ambiguous phrase on a radio, and one experienced captain's decision to move before he had the words that would have told him to stop. To understand how two jumbo jets ended up on a collision course, you first have to understand why they were at that airport at all. Neither KLM Flight 4805 nor Pan Am Flight 1736 was originally scheduled to land at Los Rodeos Airport on Tenerife. Both were bound for Gran Canaria Airport on the nearby island of Las Palmas. Earlier that day, a bomb had exploded in the terminal at Las Palmas, planted by a separatist group. No one was killed, but the airport was closed as a precaution while authorities checked for further devices, and a number of flights inbound to Las Palmas, including both the KLM and Pan Am aircraft, were diverted to the smaller Los Rodeos Airport on Tenerife to wait it out. Los Rodeos was not built to handle this kind of traffic. It had a single runway and a limited taxiway system, and on that afternoon, it was suddenly packed with large aircraft that had nowhere to go, parked in positions that would soon complicate the airport's already difficult layout. Thick fog rolled in and out over the course of the afternoon, at times reducing visibility on the airfield to just a few hundred feet. Aboard the KLM aircraft was Captain Jacob van Zanten, one of the airline's most senior and respected pilots. In fact, the airline's chief flying instructor, a man whose face appeared in the company's own advertising as the embodiment of KLM's flying standards. Also aboard was First Officer Klaus Moers and the rest of the crew and 234 passengers. When Las Palmas reopened later that afternoon, the parked aircraft at Los Rodeos began preparing to continue their journeys. But there was a growing pressure building in the KLM cockpit that had nothing to do with the weather. Dutch aviation regulations governing how many hours a flight crew could work before requiring rest were a serious concern for the KLM crew. If they did not get airborne and complete their journey within a certain window, they risked being forced into an unplanned overnight stay, disrupting the return flight to Amsterdam that hundreds of passengers were depending on. While waiting at Tenerife, Captain van Zanten made the decision to have the aircraft's fuel tanks completely topped off, rather than taking on the smaller amount that would have been sufficient for the short hop to Las Palmas alone. Investigators later concluded this was almost certainly done, so the aircraft could make its return journey to Amsterdam without needing to refuel at the congested Las Palmas airport once it reopened, saving time. That decision, made purely to manage a schedule, added a significant amount of extra weight and, critically, a large quantity of additional fuel that would soon turn a runway collision into an inferno. As the fog thickened and thinned unpredictably through the early evening, both the KLM and Pan Am aircraft began preparing to taxi toward the runway for departure. Because of how the parked aircraft were positioned, The airport's control tower instructed both planes to taxi down the single runway itself in the same direction before turning around at the far end to line up for takeoff. A workaround necessitated by the crowded, non-standard conditions at the airport that afternoon. The KLM aircraft was to go first, followed some distance behind by the Pan Am aircraft, which was instructed to exit the runway at a specific taxiway before the KLM plane would begin its own turnaround and takeoff run. In the fog, with visibility dropping in and out, the Pan Am crew had difficulty positively identifying the correct taxiway to exit onto, and there is continued debate to this day, even among investigators, about exactly which turn-off air traffic control intended for them to use. The result, whatever the precise cause, was that the Pan Am aircraft continued taxiing further down the runway than the KLM crew in the tower, and air traffic control believed it would. Meanwhile, at the far end of the runway, the KLM aircraft completed its turn and lined up, facing back down the runway toward the direction the Pan Am plane was still traveling, though neither crew could see the other through the fog. What followed was a short exchange over the radio that investigators would spend months dissecting. The KLM co-pilot read back the flight's departure clearance to air traffic control, a clearance describing the route the aircraft was meant to fly once airborne, not permission to actually begin the takeoff roll. In response, air traffic control repeated part of that clearance and added the words, "Stand by for takeoff," instructing the crew to wait. At nearly the same moment, the Pan Am crew, still on the runway themselves, transmitted, "We are still taxiing down the runway," a call meant to make unmistakably clear that the runway wasn't clear for another aircraft to use. Investigators later determined that these two transmissions arrived at nearly the same instant on the same radio frequency and interfered with one another, producing only a brief squeal of static in the KLM cockpit rather than two clear messages. Neither the Pan Am crew's critical warning nor the tower's full instruction to wait was ever clearly heard by the KLM flight crew. By this point, Captain Van Zanten had already begun advancing the throttles and releasing the brakes. The aircraft was moving. First Officer Moores radioed, "We are now at takeoff," a phrase that air traffic control, themselves unaware the KLM jet had already begun its roll, interpreted as meaning the plane was simply in position and awaiting clearance, not already accelerating down the runway. Investigators later noted that both the first officer and the flight engineer aboard the KLM aircraft appear to have had some uncertainty about whether they had truly received clearance to take off. The flight engineer, according to the cockpit voice recorder later recovered from the wreckage, asked whether the Pan Am aircraft had definitely cleared the runway. Captain Van Zanten responded that it had. He did not stop the takeoff to confirm it. Given his seniority and reputation within the airline, investigators concluded neither the first officer nor the flight engineer pressed the point further. The KLM 747 continued accelerating down the runway into fog that limited visibility to a few hundred meters. The Pan Am aircraft, still working its way toward an exit, was directly ahead. With roughly 9 seconds before impact, the Pan Am crew saw the KLM aircraft's landing lights emerge from the fog. They pushed their engines to full power in a desperate attempt to clear the runway. It was not enough time. At the last possible moment, the KLM crew also saw the Pan Am aircraft ahead and pulled back hard on the controls, attempting to lift off early to clear it. The KLM jet's tail struck the runway from the force of the maneuver, and the aircraft became briefly airborne, just long enough to slam into the upper fuselage of the Pan Am 747, tearing through it, before crashing back down the runway in flames. Both aircraft were destroyed. All 248 people aboard the KLM flight were killed. Of the 396 people aboard the Pan Am aircraft, 335 died. 61, seated largely toward the front of the aircraft, managed to escape through gaps torn in the fuselage before the flames engulfed it entirely. The investigation that followed conducted primarily by Spanish aviation authorities, with participation from Dutch and American investigators, identified the immediate cause with unusual clarity for an accident this complex. The KLM captain had begun his takeoff roll without having received, or clearly confirmed, actual clearance to do so. But investigators were equally clear that this was not simply a story of one pilot's mistake. The report specifically cited the ambiguous radio phrase, "We are now at takeoff," which could reasonably be interpreted either as a statement of present, ongoing action, or as a description of the aircraft's position, a distinction that, in this case, cost hundreds of lives. It cited the overlapping radio transmissions that had blocked both air traffic control's instruction to wait and the Pan Am crew's own warning that they were still on the runway. It cited the thick and unpredictable fog, the airport's non-standard use of the runway itself as a taxiway due to congestion, and the broader pressure created by an unusual, chaotic day that had never been part of any normal operating routine at Los Rodeos. The aviation industry's response to Tenerife was sweeping, and its effects are still felt in every cockpit today. Standardized radio phraseology was formally adopted across international aviation, specifically to eliminate the kind of ambiguity that had contributed to the disaster. Tenerife remains, decades later, the deadliest accident in the history of commercial aviation. Not because of a mechanical failure, not because of a storm, but because of a runway shared in fog by two aircraft whose crews could not see each other, could not fully hear each other, and, in the final seconds available to them, could not undo a decision that had already been made. Subscribe to Error Code Human, featuring new documentaries every week.